We're now going to talk about Italian Renaissance women artists, and these are women who are working in Italy in the 15th and particularly in the 16th century. We really don't have very many 15th century women artists in Italy that have been identified at any rate. And so one of the women artists who we're going to talk about is Caterina Vigri, better known as St. Catherine of Bologna. Now, what you're looking at here is a black and white, the picture does have some color in it, but a black and white reproduction of a page from one of the manuscripts that comes out of her convent. And so there's some good reason to believe that this is actually painted by her. As you can see, the painting is, well, we might say childlike. It is a naive work of art. And to be perfectly frank, if she were not a saint, it probably wouldn't be, it probably wouldn't be in this book. It probably wouldn't be in the books. But she was a saint. And we have very few women artists from the 15th century, so we're going to tell you about her. In fact, I'm going to show you a picture of her. And I mean, not a portrait, but herself. St. Catherine of Bologna was born to noble parents. Her father was from Bologna. Her mother was from Ferrara. And from around 1422 or 24 to 1426, she was the companion to Margherita de Este in Ferrara. Now, the de Este family was the ruling family of Ferrara. And in this context, as being a companion, a friend, to one of the de Este daughters, she received St. Catherine also received a humanist education in which she learned to read Latin and was a very well-educated woman. We have a number of very well-educated women in the 15th century from various noble families, the de Este family, of course, and particularly the Gonzaga family. And although this has nothing to do with this particular work of art, I just thought I would mention that Caterina Gonzaga, when she was 7 years old, her tutor says, well, she's really mastered Latin. I've got to get her a Greek textbook. So when she's 7 or 8 years old, she starts studying Greek. She's an exception, but it does show that women were capable of advanced scholarly activities. I told you I was going to show you a picture. I did take this off the web. But as a saint, we're actually looking at the body of St. Catherine of Bologna. She is displayed as many other, this is not unique, many other saints are in Italy. She founded an abbey of the Poor Clares in Ferrara in 1431. And the Poor Clares are the female branch of the Franciscan order. In 1456, she founded another convent, a new convent in Bologna, and she was the abbess. And there she remained and had obviously a saintly reputation because she was canonized. Her body was incorrupt. As late as 18 days after her death, it was noticed that her body did not decompose. And in the Catholic Church, in the medieval Catholic Church, it was believed that this was one of God's signs of a saint. Now, if your body decomposed, it didn't mean you were not a saint, but sometimes particular people, their bodies seemed to be miraculously preserved, and this was to believe that God was giving a sign that they were indeed a saint, a holy person. One of the interesting things about her then is, as someone said in a conference paper on her, you can actually see this artist face to face. She's dead, but you can venerate her remains. It's not pieces of bone for the relic, it's the whole body. And the other thing that's interesting about her, and probably should be mentioned, is she is the patron saint of artists. So a woman artist and saint is the patron saint of artists. Now, when I went on the World Wide Web and looked for images that were attributed to Caterina, I found this. And I didn't find anything that told me why they were attributing it to her. But I also found in some books, every once in a while I'd find a book that has a picture that says, oh, this is Caterina of Bologna's painting. We have to be careful about that because we don't really have something that is signed by her, that's actually documented. And sometimes it seems like works of art from about that period that they don't have attributed to anybody. They say, oh, it must be St. Catherine, because they want to have a picture by the saint. So I'm not going to go out on a limb and say this is by Caterina Vigri. I'm going to say that it has been so attributed. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. What probably is hers is her breviary, which has illustrations. It's from her convent. It was her breviary. Presumably, this is where we would possibly find her actual work of art.
Caterina Vigri, Saint Catherine of Bologna, drew in her breviary little images of, for example, the head of Christ. Now, when we look at these and compare them to 15th century painting by trained artists, we would say they're very naive, they're untrained. Well, she wasn't apprenticed as an artist. She was not trained as an artist. And we have to take them within the context of what they are. They are for her own personal devotional use. And so in a very simplified manner, they express her mystical visions in which she sees Christ. She communicates with Christ. And so we have this little head of Christ. And here we have a letter K in which she's placed a head of Christ. And then you can see right over here in the margins, this very simple figure of the Christ child with an orange halo, and the body is wrapped in swaddling clothes. So it's just kind of a cocoon-like shape, very simplified. Well, this refers to a vision that Catherine had. She saw Mary, and Mary placed the infant Christ child in St. Caterina's arms. This is something you often find in devotional literature, such as the Meditations on the Life of Christ, in which the person writing the meditations tells you to walk with Mary, to walk with Christ, to help out, help Mary carry the firewood, and just to be there. And I remember in the Meditations of the Life of Christ, which is a 14th century devotional text, it says that you may pick up the Christ child and hold him and kiss him, and you may freely do this because Christ came to save you from your sins. So Caterina is having this as a vision, which maybe us more ordinary mortals have to imagine. They don't use that word imagine, but it's as though that we would like to have the vision of the saint. Instead, we have paintings, or we have text, and we have our imagination, and we try to in some way have an experience that's similar to the saint who actually experiences these things. So we have these little drawings. They are not realistic Renaissance drawings. They are the record of a personal devotion and a visionary experience.
Now I'm going to go to the 16th century, and I want to talk to you about a female sculptor named Properzia de Rossi. She's from Bologna, and Bologna seems to be a very unusual city in Italy. It is a university city, and it has been suggested that because it's a university, although this is not true of other universities, but it has been suggested that they have a little bit more liberal attitude toward women, given the context of their time. So we know several women artists from Bologna. Properzia is the first one. Later in the 16th century, Lavinia Fontana, and in the 17th century, Elisabetta Sarini. Women There were very, very few, but on very rare occasions, women were allowed in the university, and rarely, but it happened. They actually had some women lecturing in the university, which I think is almost unheard of. The almost being Bologna. This relief is from the Church of San Petronio in Bologna. In that church, there are some very famous works of art. Michelangelo, the young Michelangelo, worked there. Before then, Jacopo della Quercia created some reliefs that go around the doorway to San Petronio, and that was in the 15th century. So now we're a little later than that. So she would have seen at least some early Michelangelo works. And you'll notice that the figures seem to be quite robust and muscular, so that's possibly an influence. Now, Vasari. I haven't mentioned Vasari. Many of you know who he was. Vasari, that's V-A-S-A-R-I. Vasari was a painter of the 16th century. He was also an architect of the 16th century. And he's perhaps best known as the writer of a book of the lives of the most eminent painters, sculptors, and architects, which is usually abbreviated as Vasari's Lives of the Artists, or Vasari's Lives. Because of this book, which talks about art from the late 13th century to the middle of the 16th century when he's writing, he's often called the first art historian, although there was no profession of art history. But we often cite Vasari because Vasari gives us a lot of good information about artists. Some of it may not be true. You have to sort of weigh in on how he got his information, and he sometimes tells us. And in this case, Vasari was actually in Bologna at the time of of Properzia's death, and he records the laments and reminiscences of the townspeople. Vasari says that she was the first woman sculptor, but he goes quite far in assuring us that she was truly feminine. She was skilled not only in household manners, but in infinite fields of knowledge, so that not only women, but men too, were envious. She was beautiful and played and sang better than any other woman in the city at the time. How much of that is true? Who knows? It could be just simply exaggeration, and wants to make sure that you know that even though she's an artist, she still is very feminine. She was a daughter of a notary. Her drawing teacher was Marco Antonio Raimondi. That's R-A-I-M-O-N-D-I. Raimondi is probably the most famous Renaissance printmaker from Italy, obviously Dürer and Schongauer from Germany. But he was a 16th century printmaker. He designed his own engravings, and he also did a very good business in copying drawings that of other people's artwork, and sometimes drawings that were supplied to him by other artists to create. So that's where she got her drawing training, which is no meager place. She was also known for something a little unusual, carving fruit pits. She did very tiny, I don't know how well you can see these. Can you focus in so that they can see the little faces on the pit? She did very delicate carvings on tiny surfaces of apricot, peach, and cherry pits. And 11 of these peach stones were carved and set in what you see here, the silver double-headed eagle, 12 apostles on one side, virgin saints on another. And then I have a detail of another work where it's become part of some kind of jewelry or gem. I guess that's very interesting. It wasn't appropriate for women to do small, detailed works, but at any rate, she did. She did work that was very skilled and probably very tedious. In 1520, she entered into professional competitions. She was commissioned to decorate the canopy of the high altar of Santa Maria del Baracano, in which the decorations include entwined birds' heads, fruit, foliages, and sphinxes. She was commissioned to carve part of the west portal of San Petronio. The painting records, we have the record of her payment. And so they're not certain exactly which sections she created, but the payment records name 3 sibyls, 2 angels, and 2 pictures that she created between June 1st of 1525 and August the 4th of 1526. They believe that the 2 pictures are probably marble reliefs of Solomon and Sheba, and I don't have a picture of that, I've never seen one. And this one, Joseph escaping Potiphar's wife. Now, what can we say about her style here? We can really see her as a sculptor rather than a carver of peach pits. We can say that there's certainly classical influence in the figures. We see a knowledge of anatomy, draperies clinging to anatomy, an interest in the nude or here semi-nude figure, and also some action. I mean, it's a very active scene. If you know the story from the Bible, Joseph was sold into Egypt by his very jealous brothers, and he goes to work for a man named Potiphar. And Potiphar's wife takes a liking, a sexual liking, to Joseph and tries to tempt him and tells him that he must go to bed with her or she'll tell her husband that he's tried to had sex with her. Well, Joseph resists temptation. As you see, he's fleeing. And in the Bible, it says that Potiphar's wife grabs his cloak. You can see her hand is very solidly on that cloak. And then she later displays the cloak to Potiphar and claims that Joseph tried to rape me. And then Joseph is thrown into prison and eventually is given the opportunity to interpret the dreams of the Pharaoh, and from there he rises to be no longer a slave or a prisoner, but the most prominent man in Egypt, save only the Pharaoh himself. So this is from the Bible, and we say a dynamic style, knowledge of anatomy, draperies that cling to the body. Vasari tells us some things about her personal life. Once again, we don't always know how much Vasari is accurate. He may just be repeating stories or rumors that somebody told him. Well, that's what he's doing. Are there stories that were told to him true or not? But it said that Properzia was in love with a nobleman, and they actually give his name, Anton J. Malvasio. There is some evidence that there was a connection because there was a lawsuit that cites her as his mistress. And this nobleman deigned to marry. He would not marry her because he disdained to own as his wife someone who bore a less ancient name. But he was perfectly happy to have her be his mistress. She was maligned by a jealous painter, Amico Aspertino, who ruined her reputation. And according to Vasari, she began to experiment with copper engraving. So she may have been a printmaker as well. But we have no examples of prints that are attributed to her. That would make some sense, too. She was trained by Marcantonio Raimondi, that she would possibly go into printmaking. But once again, we have no examples of that. In her 30th year, terminally ill, she was nursed, and then after she died, she was buried at the Spedale della Morte, the Hospital of the Dead. Now, that's sort of a striking thing to say because the sick were usually nursed at home. Hospitals were generally for people who had no one to take care of them. They had no family, or their servants, they didn't have enough money to pay for servants to take care of them, or maybe they were travelers who were away from their family. So it's very unusual that she'd be in Bologna and in a hospital. So one of the questions is, was she poverty-stricken? Was she without friends or family to help her? Why was she in the hospital? Or was this hospital particularly different than other hospitals, and that it was appropriate for her to be cared there? I don't know. She actually did receive a very important commission a little too late after she was dead. The newly elected Medici Pope, Clement VII, had sent emissaries to her to request her services as an artist, but she had already died. And as late as the 19th century, the sculptor Canova said that her death was one of Italy's greatest losses.